welcome, Vikram. So nice of you to make time for us, and we're very excited to speak to you. Last time I saw you, there was maybe 14 people around a dining table, and my sister in between us, so I didn't get to say very much. So I'm really looking forward, selfishly, to find out a lot more about you and to get to know you and your career a little better. So I'm doing it the old-fashioned way today. For the first time ever, I've actually written notes because your career is so sprawling in a way that I wanted to make sure that I didn't get all tangled up in my facts. All right, so let's just start. Let's start from the beginning, although we're going to do this in leaps and jumps. So you were born in New Delhi in India, and then you came to the States as an undergraduate student in English, and then you went to film school at Columbia University, right? So yes. The first thing that really interested me was that your family is really steeped in film. For those of us who don't know, your mom and your two sisters are both very well regarded in the Indian movie industry. I was wondering, when you took that BA in creative writing, did you think at that point that you were going to write film? Where were you right in those early days when it was all aspirational?
Oh, so I should say that yes, my family's, except my father, everybody is in the film business. My mother is a screenwriter, and then I have two sisters, both younger than me. Tanuja, the one who's immediately younger, is a screenwriter and director. And the youngest one, Anupama, is a film critic who happens to be married to Vinod Chopra, who's a big-time producer and director. So as we were all growing up, a lot of the conversation around the dining table was about films and so forth. My mother is a really, really passionate film goer. So in the old days, we used to get dressed up on Saturdays and go and watch movies in the theaters. So I love watching movies and nowadays television series and so forth. But I always knew that I wanted to write fiction, and I started. I was a nerdy little kid, and I lived a lot inside my own head. And I had this, I used to make up long stories, like multi-installment. They would go on for months inside my head. And I started publishing. The first story I published was in my school magazine when I was in 6th grade, when I was 11, a student-edited school magazine. And that was incredibly exciting, of course, right? Because these older boys who had read it in my all-boys very sporty and macho boarding school came and said, oh, that was a good story. So that was sort of my place in the world. And I came to the United States with a very focused intention on taking creative writing workshops and writing fiction. But then as the years passed and I did my major at Pomona College down near LA, was in English, but with a concentration in creative writing in fiction. But then, because I'd seen my mother's paychecks, I was also really aware that pretty much nobody makes a living as a writer, right? And especially if you're going to write fiction, and I'd always known that my fiction leaned towards the literary, right? Whatever that is. So because I was interested in film, and my family was in the industry, and I knew it as an industry, and I knew that I could get a job in that industry as an assistant to somebody's assistant, right? So I chickened out, actually. I had applied to both MFA programs in film and creative writing,
right?
And I'd gotten into both, and so I just thought, okay, I'm going to go to Columbia to film school,
right?
And so I showed up there and had a great time. I was learning a lot, but I became almost immediately aware that filmmaking was not an industry that was mine, because I'm really introverted. And spending all day around, on a film set, there's like 70, 80 people, and it's collaborative right from the very start.
Right.
So I then dropped out of film school and went.
I'm going to stop you there. Because while you dropped out of film school was that you were in the library and you discovered a book, an autobiography of Colonel James Sikandar Skinner.
Right.
That was to become the inspiration for Red Earth and Pouring Rain. So I wanted to know, so for me, when I first heard this story, so I'm already learning things, because when I first read the story, I thought, oh, I wonder whether I wonder what it was that so moved you away from film, because I assumed that with your family's background and you going to film school, that you're kind of like film first and then the novel interrupted. But I'm hearing that actually it was the other way around, that you really, the
Yeah,
quiet kid who was the novelist at heart, kind of went to film school because that's what
right.
my family did. So, but there must have been something though that like kind of just that catalyzed that moment, because in many ways it was, your inciting incident was this book, right? It kind of like
Yeah.
pivoted, shifted your entire trajectory. So what in those first few pages of that book really kind of gripped you?
So I was just wandering around the Columbia Library, in the shelves, that part of the shelves in an upper floor, where they had a bunch of the Indian nonfiction books stacked. And I looked up, it was very cinematic, and the sun was hitting the top shelf, and I saw the spines of two leather-bound volumes. So I, reached up and got them down, and it turned out to be the translated autobiography of this man called James Skinner, whose father was British and whose mother was Indian, right? And we're talking now this in the early 19th century.
Mhm.
So he was one of the first people who grew out of that encounter between colonial British and India, right? And his life was both exciting and tragic in that he was caught between these two worlds, right? Neither here nor there. And he became very famous as a commander of light cavalry units. And I'd heard of him before, actually, because later in the 20th century, they became a tank regiment, an armored regiment, and a very famous one in the Indian Army, the senior regiment of cavalry. So I took those books home to my grad student housing and started reading them, and with a sense of recognition. And I pretty much instantly knew that I wanted to write about this guy, right? And of course, then, I mean, the narrative I was imagining was pretty epic, and it involves a typing monkey. So I was not going to be able to do that, right? I didn't have the budget for that kind of stuff. So I mean, it was just kind of a feeling of recognition, right? And then I had a project, I knew what I was going to do, and I showed up at Johns Hopkins and unpacked my stuff, and the next morning I started writing the book.
Right. So, so going back for just that one moment, when you said that there was a feeling of recognition, I imagine that you meant recognition that this was your next project, but also was there a feeling of recognition in that he had like one, as you said, like one foot in two cultures, and was that how you were feeling yourself at that time out here in the States?
Well, no, I think like all post-colonial cultures feel this way, right? Because everything that we encountered from the early days of colonialism, what happened was this one-sided, where one side had the power culturally, economically, in military terms, with the West, right? And so we had to learn different languages, we had to learn different ways of being. So I think that still to this day in India is very much part of the cultural, the economic, the political scene, right? So there's a kind of recovery that has gone on in very many post-colonial countries, right? As you try and deal with both of these forces, or the many forces. So it's not just me. I think it's everyone, right? Down to the villager who's now on a cell phone, right?
Right,
So,
right.
at all sort of economic layers, right? This thing has been true, not just in India, right? Like if you think about China, if you think about Africa, everybody's gone through some version of this.
Okay, before you actually joined us, I told the audience that I would not be able to go through all the accolades that you received, because we would spend the whole hour with just me reading the awards list. I mean, this book came out to such tremendous critical acclaim. But before we actually talk about that, Red Earth and Pouring Rain, I just want to indulge myself. I don't have enough time we don't have enough time to actually go into craft very much. But in terms of this one book, because I love literary fiction, I love historical fiction, and I love being in different cultures. I'm also like a third world child. Not a third world child, what do they call it? A third,
Global South.
third culture child. Have you heard that term?
Yeah.
So a third culture child, for those who haven't, is like if you're not in your mother's culture, you don't really belong fully in the culture that you're living in. And I can't remember what other culture you're not quite part of. But certainly a lot of colonial kids, like I was growing up in Hong Kong, felt that way. And so this book had a lot of appeal to me. I was really, really fascinated, though, that you just said that when it occurred to you, even though it was inspired by this autobiography of Skinner, you saw it immediately as there's going to be this huge epic novel that features this typing monkey, right? The typing monkey was there from the start. Like where did that?
Yeah, no, it's weird. So often what happens to me, and I think happens to all of us, not just writers, but all artists, is that things come from deep within you, right? And you have no idea why or how, right? So I often work in terms of like, I just get a vague image of a landscape and a character and a sense of emotion. And that's where I begin, and Red Earth and Pouring Rain more than others, because I knew the arc of Skinner's life. I knew where I would end up. But there's two narratives in there. One is 20th century, the other is 19th century. But I didn't have any idea what was going to happen in the 20th century one. But I knew that the typing monkey was going to feature heavily, and I actually knew that at Columbia. I don't know again where that image came from.
Right.
But the idea of the way that that book is structured is that there is a narrator, like an outer narrator, right? In this case, the monkey who types out the story, and then there are tales within tales, right?
Yeah.
So there's multiple layers, and that's a very, very old Indian storytelling structure.
Right.
Both the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are told like that.
Right. And for me, what it reminded me most of probably was like the Arabian Nights, that kind of like a framing narrative that allows the narratives within the narratives.
Yeah.
Another thing that really interested me about that was that you actually made a point. I think I can't remember how many pages you were into the narrative where the typing monkey's been telling a story, like he's a narrator, and then you have someone chastise him for being so slow, and saying, keep telling the story this way, all the kids are going to go away. So there was like this moment where I thought, well, for that thought to have found itself on the page, you must have thought about that and wondered whether it was too slow for the Western reader. Did you wonder about that?
I don't think much about Western readers, actually, right? So I have an audience in my head, and it's my sisters and my mother and a couple of friends, and so it's mostly Indian, right? So I'm speaking in an Indian kind of English to these people inside my head. But the reason that occurred to me is that you do hear that kind of thing all over the place now, right? Like shortening attention spans and so forth. But I don't think that's really true, right? I mean, and certainly I grew up listening to the stories from the epics from my mother and grandmother, and hearing them, like there's these things where some wise person, man or woman, preacher, will get together and do a kind of discourse, and those go on for days, right? And now we know, right? Like think of the Game of Thrones series of books, right? I'm not talking about the television series alone. I think we once you're in,